Thank you very much for Justina for the invitation and all the co-sponsors. I'm really happy to be here. It's a big honor to be here. And today I'm going to present my new book. And this is a book based on research or formal research of about 10 years from 2010 until 2020. But it's really building on extensive field work prior to the formal research for this book. So I started going to Poland in 1989 as a 19-year-old student. And I arrived in the summer of 1989, just 2 days before the first semi-democratic elections of Poland on June 4th. And then started going to Poland regularly in the 1990s, and I lived there for about 3 years in the 1990s, and again for a year in the 2000s. So I witnessed some of the beginnings of what is now called the Jewish revival. I had a break in my travels to Poland from 2005 to 2010, when there was a growth spurt in events related to Jewish life in Poland. And I became really intrigued when I went in 2010 about what was going on and what was really generating that level of enthusiasm for anything Jewish and everything Jewish in Poland by different sectors of Polish society. And this is what the book is about. I'm trying to make sense of the resurrection of Jewish culture on the one hand, and the renewal of Jewish communal life. And so, what Poland is and should be has been at the center of public debates and political fight since the fall of communism. And Polish society has become even more divided with the rise of far-right populism in recent years. And to characterize this very grossly, I think it's still useful to do so, one faction favors a nationalist vision represented by the Law and Justice Party and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, according to which the identity of Poles is crystallized around Catholicism, conservative values, and a national narrative articulated around Polish martyrdom and heroism. The other faction supports Poland's membership in the EU, espouses progressive civic values and secularism, and is engaged in significant soul-searching about the participation of Poles in violent crimes against Jews before, during, and after the Second World War. And that difficult process of soul-searching and reckoning with the past is in turn described as anti-Polish defamation or a politics of shame by the far right. And the current government attempts to stall that process of reckoning with the past. In both camps, the figure of the Jew plays a prominent role, portrayed as a threat to the nation for some and as a quasi-savior for the other. At the same time, since the fall of communism, Poland's small Jewish community has undergone a significant renaissance, and a substantial number of non-Jewish public figures, memory activists, and ordinary citizens are engaged in a multifaceted resurrection of Jewish culture. And that is a twin phenomenon commonly referred to as Poland's Jewish revival. So to give you an idea of what is meant by the Jewish revival, and to give you an idea of the scope and depth of that interest, there is approximately 40 festivals of Jewish culture in Poland today. Most of them, so the oldest was founded in Krakow in 1988 and was the result of democratic movements of the 1980s and the Solidarity movement. But most of them were created, as I will show on the next slide, actually, in the early 2000s. So you see the Krakow Festival created in 1988, 1990s, you have other ones appearing. 2000s, especially after the EU accession, where there's funds for cultural events that are created, and then the 2010. So this slide shows actually the extent to which the festivals of Jewish culture is not just a tourist thing for foreigners. It's not just in Krakow, Warsaw, or Wrocław, or Gdańsk. It's in very different towns, although the biggest ones are in larger cities. And it shows that this is not just a cosmopolitan phenomenon also. It's very widely spread and popular. And although some festivals that had emerged in the previous years have disappeared, so the blue dots on the map, you can see that some appeared and disappeared. Most of them have endured, which means that there's a public for this. And obviously, who goes to those festivals? It's not really made by and for Jews. There are too few Jews to actually make this a viable commercial enterprise. This is primarily meant for non-Jewish Poles. Klezmer music, restaurants, clubs, bookshops have also become very popular. And you have very important museums that have been created mostly again after 2000. So the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, the Galicia Museum in Krakow, the Ghetto's Eagle Pharmacy, Schindler's Factory Museum, and numerous also smaller museums in smaller towns, or history museums that have developed Jewish sections of their Polish history museums. You also have the creation of memory spaces. Some have long-lasting effects, some have disappeared. So here we have an initiative in Warsaw that would mark the perimeter of the former Warsaw Ghetto. And without this, you actually could not really grasp the size of the ghetto, because new streets were built on the former ghetto. So there's no traces. So that's one initiative. The other one is ephemeral, was Próżna Street, where that's the only remaining block with old settlements, kamienice, that memory activists basically placarded with photos of Jews to mark that site in ruins as Jewish site. And these have been renovated since and has somehow disappeared. You also have commemorative practices. So yesterday was the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and an initiative of the daffodil as a symbol of that uprising, the resistance, has become very popular and throughout Poland. I will skip this and stay here. So other important developments for which I don't have visuals, for example, is the academic interests in Jewish studies. So in the past 2 decades, several Jewish and Holocaust studies programs were founded at many universities. Yiddish and Hebrew are offered at academic institutions, but also through smaller organizations and private tutors. Historian Marcin Wodziński, who's director of Jewish studies at the University of Wrocław, has documented that in the period between 2011 and 2021, about 100 academic books and several hundred articles on Jewish topics were published every year on average. So imagine 100-something books and couple hundred articles every year between 2011 and 2021 were published, many written in a language to be accessible to a broader public. This also explains why there's, several new Judaica bookstores that have proliferated. Last indicator of the Jewish revival, for which there are no official statistics but were reported to me by rabbis and various community leaders, is a modest but steady number of conversions to Judaism, either from people who are discovering that they had Jewish roots and feel compelled to return to the source, or from other people, Poles with no origins but called by the appeal of Judaism. So what we call the Jewish revival is a very broad and multifaceted phenomenon that can be observed in a variety of social spaces. And one might be tempted to see non-Jewish Poles' interest in all things Jewish as simply anti-Semitism, or to reduce it to a reaction to Poland's rightward turn, to see it as a counter-movement. But that interpretation is empirically wrong, since the beginnings of the Jewish revival precede Poland's sharp turn to the right. So how can we make sense of these seemingly contradictory phenomena then? Right-wing populism and anti-Semitism on the one hand, Polish liberalism and philo-Semitism on the other. And how can we make sense of non-Jewish Poles' interest in a variety of Jewish-related topics and issues, and to engage with Jewish culture also at a variety of levels? So to be sure, the Jewish turn must be read in relationship to the end of communism. While Jewishness and the Holocaust were taboo topics under communism, after 1989 it became possible to talk about these issues and to dig into one's family past. Many Poles then discovered Jewish origins, and those who already knew could then openly talk about them. So when we're talking about the Jewish community in Poland, I was watching CNN last night. The story there was that there used to be 3 million Jews before the war, and then there's only 3,000 now in Poland. It's actually much more complicated than this. So estimates vary greatly, between 7,000 and 40,000, depending on how we count Jewishness. So about 7,000 Polish residents declared Jewish identity in the last census. And when I asked community leaders, including the chief rabbi of Poland, he would tell me, how many do you think there are? Double the number and add one, because there's always one coming out of the closet. So the 40,000 would be about 20,000 people who have some Jewish roots, who identify with the Jewish community, might not be formal members. Many of those people are not or could not be recognized as Jews from an Orthodox perspective, for example. They're not coming from the matrilineal line, but there's great potential for the growth of Jewish life in Poland because of a lot of people regaining a Jewish identity. The opening of the Eastern Bloc also made institutional support and funding for the renewal of Jewish communal life available, and it also facilitated the development of Holocaust tourism, which in turn participated in an ongoing gentrification of formerly neglected Jewish neighborhoods and sites. And that is especially true for Krakow, which is only about an hour from the Auschwitz-Birkenau museum. And Kazimierz, the city's Jewish district, greatly benefited from a Polish Schindler's List tourism boom. So you see here, these little trolley buses that taking people from the old town Kazimierz, the ghetto, Schindler's factory, or here a tourist agency offering to retrace Schindler's List places where the film was shot, actually that often were not even part of the historical record. The opening of archives, a new historiography on World War II, and Holocaust tourism brought Poles into contact with a very different narrative of the war than the one they had been socialized under for half a century, namely that they had been the main victims of the war. And they experienced at that point, and I'm talking about the mid-1990s, they experienced what I've called in my first book a narrative shock. A narrative shock that propelled some to insist, for example, that Auschwitz-Birkenau was a Polish site of martyrdom, marking the site with the cross, as the cross is, for many Polish Catholics, at once a religious and a national symbol. In 2000 and 2001, with Jan Gross's publication of Neighbors, they experienced another shock wave, discovering their own role in the Holocaust, leading to what is perhaps the most significant transformation in historical consciousness and identity in the past 3 decades, initiating a process of national demystification on one hand and denial on the other. And people often, and I claim actually, that there's a Poland before and after the publication of Neighbors, and the entire debate on Jedwabne that continues to this day through subsequent publications by Jan Gross or by Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski, for example. And then in 2004, Poland joins the EU, which opens up funding for a host of cultural programs and civic participation in those programs, which kind of helps to jumpstart some of these festivals and other initiatives, museums, etc. So this is a specific historical context in which the Jewish revival is taking place, both the renewal of Jewish communal life and the interest of non-Jewish Poles in Jewish culture. It explains some of its timing and scope, but there's also something else going on. And so to make sense of this multifaceted phenomenon, the book considers macro, meso, and micro dimensions of Philosemitism. Philosemitism, which I define very broadly as non-Jews' support of and even identification with Jews. Although I conducted fieldwork in Jewish communities and Jewish spaces, my primary objective was to understand non-Jewish Poles' motivations for resurrecting Jewish culture in Poland. So in terms of data, I conducted participant observation in several Polish cities, festivals and special events, commemorative marches, or the opening of the Poli Museum and the 3-day celebrations then. I conducted 104 tours of the Polin Jewish Museum together with assistants, documented monuments and cityscapes, conducted participant observation at the JCC Kraków, communal events in Jewish communities, and I also accompanied a birthright trip for young Jewish Poles who went to Israel for the first time. In addition to this, I conducted over 100 in-depth open interviews with Jewish, non-Jewish figures, and also collected archival research and collected documents for different chapters. So analyzing Jewish-centered initiatives sponsored by state institutions or NGOs, civic projects, and everyday practices of ordinary citizens provided me with a view of the production of the Jewish cultural revival as well as its consumption and recreation by participants. My research shows that non-Jewish cultural elites, social activists, ordinary citizens, and some states' agencies' memory work is part of a broader attempt to soften and stretch the symbolic boundaries of Polishness. It is a way to articulate a civic national project and to build pluralism in a monocultural society. And by monocultural society, I mean, I refer there to the ethno-religious makeup of Poland's population since World War II and the move of the Polish border to the west, ethnic cleansing of Ukrainians, Belarusian also, and of Jewish survivors and the Jewish opposition in 1968, which makes Poland now about 90 to 95% ethnically Polish and nominally Catholic. So why is the center-left and activists trying to build multiculturalism in Poland and to resurrect Jewish culture? Why the focus on Jews? One reason, there's several reasons, but let's begin with two. One is that Jewishness is also an ethno-Catholic, an ethno-religious category that has traditionally been the opposite, perceived by Poles as the opposite, polar opposite of the Polak Catholic. The second reason is that Western-style capitalism, socialism, and cosmopolitanism, so hallmarks of modernity, are associated with Jewishness. So as Jewishness is standing for these phenomena and values, Poland is said by the right to be ruled by Jews, by symbolic Jews, who must be neutralized. Hence the anti-Semitism in a country with very few Jews. And this is what former dissident Adam Michnik, who's also the editor-in-chief of Poland's most important newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, calls magical anti-Semitism. And he says, okay, quote-unquote, normal anti-Semitism goes this way. Adam Michnik is a Jew, therefore he's a thief, a liar, etc. In Poland, magical anti-Semitism works differently. Adam Michnik is a thief, a liar, a left-winger, therefore he is a Jew. And the same logic extends to Polish philo-Semitism. If Jews represent modernity, cosmopolitanism, socialism, and capitalism, therefore they should be supported and Jewish culture should be resurrected and promoted. So this is how, to a certain extent, liberal youth wear T-shirts and brandish posters in protests against Catholic nationalists, subversively and sarcastically claiming that they are Jews. A 40-year-old lawyer living in Warsaw, for example, was commenting this brand, Risk Oi, who produced pricey T-shirts with Jewish slogans. You had me at Shalom. Or, oh, we don't see this one. I had another one, another picture. Commenting this brand saying, well, wearing Risk Oi is like taking part in a public discussion about Jews in Poland, that Jews live here and that Jews can live here. And I find it interesting that also the person that they chose for the campaign is African descended or partly African black woman, Polish woman, right? So that Jewishness also becomes associated, even for that company that's Jewish owned, with multiculturalism and different types of Poles that they want to put forward as their vision of Poland. And that comment that wearing Jewish clothing is like taking part in a public discussion about Jews in Poland, that they live there, is important because it highlights that a lot of the discussions about Jews in Poland is actually one about the identity of Poland. It's also a critique of the still dominant vision of the nation as ethnically Polish and nominally Catholic, which is a clear finding of my research. My interviews with key cultural entrepreneurs and numerous non-Jewish activists shows that their promotion of Jewish culture is part of a broader attempt to counter the monopoly of the Catholic right over the definition of Polishness and to expand what it means to be Polish. So let's see what Janusz Makuk, the co-founder and the director of Krakow's famous Festival of Jewish Culture, told me in one of our conversations. So he told me, Kraków was always a multicultural place where cultural pluralism was often very obvious. However, this national monotheism, religious monotheism that was created after the Second World War is scorching me, it's hurting me. I really don't like this. So let's go back to what is the basis of our spirituality, actually, since Jews were Polish citizens. This comment is significant as it shows how one of the key actors in the resurrection of Jewish culture in Poland grounds that cultural enterprise in a political project, that of expanding notions of Polishness, but more importantly and radically, that of shifting the very idiom of nationhood toward a civic definition, defining the nation as a community of citizens instead of a community of culture. Consider what Anya, a non-Jewish 30-something art historian, member of a Jewish dance group that is touring Poland and Central Europe, tells me. On the one hand, Jewish culture, let's say, is oriental, But on the other hand, because it developed in Poland, in spite of everything, it's somehow very much tied with Poland, yes? It's kind of an exotic element in our environment. It's not something like Swahili somewhere far in Africa, but rather something that is different from Polish culture, yet at the same time related to it, inseparable from it even. And I should say that actually this woman was from Silesia. So when I asked her later in the interview if she spoke Silesian, she looked at me shocked, not seeing where the question was coming from, and said, well, why would I learn that dialect? It's Gwara. You know, my grandmother speaks it, but why would I? I said, well, you're learning Yiddish, so why not also Silesian? And she was actually not even seeing the connection I was making with this. So, you know, Yiddish belongs to something different, and it has different symbolic capital, cultural capital that speaking Silesian or another dialect, for example, does not have. So a third reason why the focus is particularly on Jews that is expressed in this quote here is that Jews, unlike Ukrainians, large numbers of Ukrainians in Poland even prior to the war, so unlike Ukrainians who are too similar, or the Vietnamese, the largest visible minority that tends to be also heavily residing in Warsaw, and they are too different, Jews are both exotic and somewhat indigenous, right? It developed in Poland. It's very much tied with Poland. They're different enough, Jews are different enough, yet were nourished from the Polish soil and grew on these lands, as another interviewee told me. Jewishness is thus both other and ours, comments that were made spontaneously by countless interviewees. In that sense, they're the perfect indigenous other. This indigenization of multicultural Poland is very important because civic discourses can be perceived as a remnant of Communist Party rhetoric and or as an export from the European Union and neoliberal Polish elites. Progressive civic nationalists must therefore work twice as hard to make their vision of the nation legitimate and quote-unquote authentically Polish. Public intellectuals have tried to promote the civic vision by reconstructing a narrative that emphasizes, for example, the political heritage of the nation by looking back to 16th century religious tolerance, to the First Republic's multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state, to Poland's elective monarchy and the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791, to the interwar liberal traditions, and to a certain extent to Solidarity's peaceful resistance and civic activism in the 1980s. But they've had very limited success because the right also uses some of these tropes and their symbols. So because the right also uses some of these historical themes, the Jewish trope becomes especially salient because the right is not really that interested in it, although more so recently because they're reshifting the narrative. We can talk about this a little bit later. The large number of Jews who settled in Poland thus becomes key for a Polish civic narrative. As I have heard many times in various venues, when Jews were being kicked out from Southern and Western Europe, King Kazimierz the Great was welcoming them in Poland. So embracing elements of Jewish culture becomes a way to plausibly demonstrate that to be Polish is not just to participate in Catholic practices and folklore, because Poland welcomed refugees, centuries ago, which makes them basically European avant la lettre. And that's very important discursive strategy that's employed to show that Poles are European and they were even multicultural before multiculturalism was fashionable, for example. So Poland's Jewish past also provides plenty of cultural material to articulate an alternative national discourse presented as Poland's true essence, its authentic multicultural self. Ula explained to me that she wanted to learn about Jews and Jewish culture to better know herself as a Pole. Well, basically, there's been a Jewish presence in our country, u nas, for 800 years on our lands here in Poland. So there's this influence that we don't remember anymore because there are almost no Jews left in Poland. But it's important to know that culture so that we can better know ourselves, our identity, who we are. And so, as there are few Jews in Poland, also, moreover, it becomes easier to project onto them fantasies of the past or the future. So when we're thinking back of the different reasons why a lot of the multicultural discourses are articulated around Jews and Jewishness, so I said, you know, it's the opposite category to the Polak Catholic. There are few Jews, what did I say also? They're both indigenous and other. So there's multiple reasons why Jews are, especially Jews, symbolic Jews, or Jewishness as a symbolic category is especially fruitful, productive for civic nationalists. Paradoxically, however, ethnicity and religion remain the very categories through which civic nationalists attempt to transcend ethno-religious nationalism. The conundrum is the basis of what I call the tragedy of Polish civic nationalism. To escape ethnic nationalism, civic nationalists must resort to the very categories of ethnic nationalism, ethnicity, and religion. Part of that tragedy is that in order to achieve the goals of civic nationalism and multiculturalism, the Jew must remain other. And Jewish culture becomes a means through which Poles reinvent themselves. So, Janusz Makuch again, whether people know it or not, it is a fact that Jews for many, many centuries made tremendous contributions to Polish culture. So when we're talking about Polish culture, we're equally talking about Jewish culture. Without the contribution of Jews, true Polish culture could not exist. Forget it. What I'm trying to do is to help Poles realize what is theirs. And this is a very important comment again, especially the last line. What does that mean that Poles need to realize what is theirs? What does that mean that Jewish culture is Polish culture? What I'm trying to do is to help Poles realize what is theirs. So I understood what he meant, but I also realized how problematic that was, and how it was understood by Jews in Poland, but also by my North American audiences when I was presenting that work. The first idiom, the first questions I would necessarily have was, how is this not blackface? How is this not playing Indian? How is this not cultural appropriation? And I would go back to Poland and actually pose those questions to members of the Jewish community. How do you feel about those festivals? How do you feel about people who want to convert or who wear Jewish clothing and who are not Jewish? And it also came to, their answers came to really make me question cultural appropriation as an appropriate concept to understand what was going on. Was it the right concept to make sense of Polish Philosemitism? And perhaps not only because cultural appropriation lumps together a very wide area of practices with different meanings, but also because it's a normative term rather than a concept or a heuristic device. So I found that we needed finer instruments, and in the book I developed a typology of what I call registers of engagement with the culture of the other that allows us to analyze these diverse practices. So what are these? So one we could call casual engagement, which is the occasional consumption of Jewish cultural products. It could be in a cafe, a concert, a festival, or consuming kosher vodka, rumored to be purer than pure vodka already, because it doesn't. The rumor is that because it's pure and kosher, you don't get a hangover. So a lot of magical thinking there. So that's something that's kind of sporadic once in a while. That's without much, reflection on this. There's another form of engagement that I call romantic philosemitism or romantic engagement, which is characterized by a uncritical, nostalgic view of Jewish culture in Poland's multicultural past. So this is a memory activist here writing, "I miss you, Jew. I miss you in Poland, in all these little villages and big cities. You left a vacuum there, both in space and in my heart. I just wanted you to know that, Polak." And I analyzed about 350 testimonies that were posted on a website that this Betlejewski created. He also had a series of actions throughout Poland where they would do murals or graffitis, "I miss you, Jew." And what I found is even people who felt that this was something about reclaiming a Jewish past and acknowledging the Jewish presence in Poland, it was really marred by a very problematic romantic vision of the past, where even here you left a vacuum in those. They didn't leave a vacuum, really. I mean, they were not the agent making the vacuum. They did not disappear or leave. They were murdered. And so there's all sorts of ways in which a disappearance of Jews from the Polish national landscape, even in projects like this that want to reclaim the name Jew from anti-Semites, is itself problematic. This multiculturalization of the past is problematic insofar as it conceals the complex dynamic of ethnic and religious hierarchies, discrimination, and power struggles common to stratified communities of all sizes, and which in Polish society placed ethnic Catholic Poles at the top and Jews at the bottom. Political engagement and performative solidarity. That is a less common but more visible form of engagement with Jewish culture, as in the cases of non-Jews wearing kippahs, yellow paper daffodils and Stars of David on their lapels in April and up to May, or clothing with Jewish slogans in order to express commemorative solidarity or to make political statements in the public sphere. So you see the young man there, the hipster with the kippah is not Jewish. He used to work at Risk Oy. It's not seen as a problem at all that he's wearing a kippah as a non-Jew. Basically, he wants to share the statement. It's a statement that he's making that being a Jew in Warsaw is cool and safe. When I talk to rabbis about this, how do you feel about, goyim wearing kippahs on the street? They say, well, we ask them to wear kippahs when they come to the synagogue or to Jewish sites, and some of them do it for political purposes, others forget. And he, the chief rabbi of Poland, for example, is American-born, says, well, in the 70s, I went to a sweat lodge. I wanted to understand Native American culture. Well, they're doing kind of the same thing here. So it's part of a mnemonic awakening, but for some also political awakening and part of a performative solidarity to recognize what Jews endured during World War II, even though many Poles, or perhaps most Poles, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising did not react. You also have critical introspective register of engagement that involves deep reflection on blind spots regarding past and present Polish-Jewish relations and Jewish issues more broadly. It is most common in those with a high level of commitment to Jewish-related institutions and processes, like studying Jewish history and researching Polish-Jewish relations, working in the Jewish museums, or volunteering in Jewish or Jewish-related institutions. Empathetic engagement is a type of engagement displayed by participants who feel a personal connection to the Jewish past and the current revival, whether through family history, personal relationships, or individual commitments, and they express this commitment through their lifestyle choices and acts. So these are volunteers at the JCC in Krakow. There's a lot of people, non-Jewish, who volunteer for a variety of Jewish organizations. They do that because they want to learn more about Jewish culture, Jewish history, but also meet Jewish individuals. And that's a space where they can do that. They forge relationships with Jewish individuals, both Polish and others. And they start, some of them marry Jewish individuals, some of them then go on to start a process of conversion or give biblical names to their children. Empathetic engagement is both a form of alliance with Jews and a form of resistance to the dominant ethno-Catholic vision of Polishness. And most of the volunteers I interviewed were actually Catholic, many of them practicing Catholic, but also practicing Catholic in a very specific form of Catholicism that's more intellectual and more liberal, associated with Tygodnik Powszechny, for example, or in Krakow with the Dominican church. And then there's crude cultural appropriation, which actually in my 10 years of field work, this was taken in Chmielnik, is actually quite rare. That's the only place where I encountered such shocking form of cultural appropriation. So it's when individuals and organizations engage with Jewish culture at this level and lacking obvious awareness of how problematic the practice is and how offensive it can be to Jewish individuals. And actually, I was myself very shocked when I noticed this and wondered whether, I should put this in the book, especially since it's so graphic that it captures the reader's attention, and it also, quote unquote, confirms many people's imagination of what the Jewish revival is about. But I included it actually because it is one form, but we might want to talk about this also, about the methodological and epistemological encounters like this. What I found problematic was asking him to take a picture, and he was clearly happy to do so. So this is a part of entertainment during the festival, a festival that's organized by an individual who has raised funds and oversaw the renovation of the former synagogue and turned it into a museum. So these registers can be placed on a spectrum defined by degrees of reflection. The first three, and actually I put the crude one at the end because otherwise it detracts, I think. Anyway, the first three, crude cultural appropriation, casual engagement, and romantic philosemitism, are unreflective. They lack consideration of a given practice's meaning or potential impact on Jewish individuals, while the last three are by definition reflective. Within the unreflective and the reflective poles, the registers of engagement are not mutually exclusive. Casual and romantic engagements can overlap, for instance, and political engagement can accompany empathetic versions of cultural appropriation. One register of engagement can also lead to another across the spectrum. An unreflective, casual engagement with Poland's Jewish past, so going to Polin Museum, for example, may evolve into critical introspective register of engagement. Some pairings, however, are unlikely. It's improbable that an individual engaging with Jewish culture in the critical introspective register would also engage in crude cultural appropriation. But you could have performative solidarity and casual engagement by going, for example, to a cafe or restaurant or a concert. The typology then serves less to classify specific practices than to provide an interpretive framework for analyzing them. It seeks to avoid dismissing a wide range of Jewish-related activities by non-Jewish Poles as yet another case of undifferentiated cultural appropriation. Yet it is clearly the discourses and practices in the reflective registers of engagement that serve to deconstruct Polishness and reconstruct it potentially along new lines. So we should pause to ask whether the resurrection of Jewish culture by non-Jews reaches enough audiences and provokes sufficient critical insight into notions of Polishness to spur significant change. Is this still, if it's the reflective types of practices that actually have the potential to deconstruct Polish national identity and reconstruct it along new lines, these are primarily elite or restricted to a smaller group of people, and is that enough, therefore, to change things? One thing that's important is that although they may not overlap across the spectrum in one individual, they can in the public sphere. So in Chmielnik, where we had this teenage boy walking around as a water carrier disguised as a ultra-Orthodox Hasidic boy, was coexisting with this beautifully renovated synagogue and museum, and with the Polin Museum on wheels, where you had people learning about different rituals of Judaism. So in the public sphere, it often happens that you see different forms of practices coexisting. So what does the Polish case, the case of Poland's Jewish turn, teach us? So my work shows the ways and the extent to which dominant modes of imagining the nation shape not only formal membership rules, such as citizenships, that's the work of Rogers Brubaker, for example, in France and Germany, but it also shapes symbolic membership to the national community. That the nation is generally understood in ethnic terms in Poland, as is the case elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, explain why some non-ethnically Polish residents and citizens may never fully belong. It also explains why some members of the dominant ethno-national groups are symbolically excluded from the national community for their political leanings, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, or gender identity by being ethnicized. So, for example, more and more, and I've heard this a lot in my field work for my first book, that more liberal priests and bishops were accused of being Jews. Even John Paul II was accused of being Jewish. Or LGBTQ, the gay lobby, are often accused of being Jewish, so much that Agnieszka Graf and Magdalena Schroda says that gays are the new Jews. So that's a way that you otherize ideological opponents by turning them into a Jew. My work also highlights that regardless of how progressive a national project may be, there remains a problematic tension in expanding the symbolic boundaries of the nation through the other, as that other, whether real or symbolic, remains malleable at the hands of those who control the category. The symbolic power exerted to articulate the principles of vision and division for a particular group, to quote Pierre Bourdieu, is therefore still violent, even when it is used to expand the symbolic boundaries of the group. Considering the motivations of individuals engaging with the culture of other groups and the personal meanings their practices have for them remains essential if we're to gain any understanding of phenomena like Philosemitism, performative solidarity, or cultural appropriation. And the identification, I think, of different registers of engagement with the culture of the other should be helpful in studying cultural appropriation in different contexts, in the US, for example. But this is not to say that part of the revival is not about other properly Jewish processes, for it obviously is. And I analyze the renewal of Jewish communal life proper throughout the book and in one specific chapter as well. What I argued today is that one must nonetheless see a relation between non-Jewish Poles' support of and participation in the Jewish revival and their desire to build a Poland that is different from the one forcefully promoted by the Catholic Church and the far right. This is not to say also that the hegemonic place of Catholicism in Poland is only or even primarily contested and countered via the support of Jewish communal life and Judaism. It is also operated via critiques of the Church and of traditional forms of Polish Catholicism, formal demands for a stricter separation of church and state, and apostasy movements, and in the support of the rights of various alternative groups, primarily sexual minorities and feminists, who, significantly enough, also support the revival of Jewish communal life, as they understand their minority status and their struggle as one they share with Jews. In the end, my research reiterates the case for interpretive sociology. That is, that it's only by paying attention to the multiple varied motivations and meanings of cultural phenomena that we appreciate their full significance. Without such an approach to the Polish Jewish revival, we might remain stuck in bewildered incomprehension or limited to its normative valuation. So multi-sided, multi-method analysis of discursive representation, material and visual culture, and performative practices make possible the peeling back of various layers of Poland's Jewish turn. And to show how ultimately the phenomenon is related to the structure of Polish nationalism, collective memory, and the politics of history in that country. Thank you.